Okay, so officially recording. Happy Monday. When we left off, we had just really started talking about the first couple of pages of organizational design and development. And so we're going to start, excuse me, in that section on page 89. And the next design element that we have to consider when we're looking at design and development from the perspective of setting up or organizing our business is based on decision making. And decision making in this element is really about whether or not your decision making is going to be centralized or decentralized. So think as an example of a company that has a corporate office and then has multiple locations throughout the US or even the world, but let's stick with the US for now. So they have regions throughout the US, and whether or not those regions can make their own decisions autonomously would answer the question of whether decision-making is centralized or not centralized, and we call that decentralized. And so there are, again, we want to look at the advantages and disadvantages of both. And so advantages of centralization would be control. That would be one top advantage, that having the locations throughout the US make decisions in the same way that the corporate entity is essentially telling the locations how those decisions need to be made, then there's an assurance that things are being done the way that they are intended to be done, at least conceptually. And then in a decentralized environment, the pros for that particular area are, or that decision are, I think, a couple of different things. Number one, the strength of the leaders in those demographic areas. And so I've worked pretty much all my career in decentralized environments where we had the autonomy at the regional or divisional level to make decisions that made sense for our part of the business. So of course there's always going to be a central entity that is providing information and providing guidance to each of the regions, if you will. But in my experiences being in a region, you know, we had those overarching goals, but it was really up to us as a regional leadership team to decide how to get there along the parameters, of course, for the most part of the business and the legalities associated with it, whatever those might be. So that's the difference between centralized and decentralized. Really one of the core elements has to be knowledge and strength of the leadership team at the decentralized level. Because if you're decentralized and your leaders don't know what they're doing, then, you know, all things go downhill pretty fast. So that one's pretty easy. So I think we talked about functional versus product departmentalization, and then centralized versus decentralized. And then our next one, page 90, is formal versus informal when we talk about coordinating mechanisms and the subject of personal discretion. And so when we look at the continuum on the far left side here, we're seeing direct supervision and rules here on this far left, where on the right-hand side, we're seeing more about mutual adjustment, meaning that the employees have the ability to make adjustments on their own without necessarily having to go back and ask questions or ask permission before they make those decisions. So that's where the discretion comes in. There's a number of pieces that you'll see at the bottom of page 90 that have to do with this particular design and development. So we've got direct supervision, standardization of processes and output and skills. We've also got mutual adjustment. And I think one of the takeaways in this particular item on page 91 is, technically it would be the first paragraph at the top, which says a critical issue in choosing a coordinating mechanism concerns the need for information and how the information is collected, processed, and disseminated. And so if you're in a situation where you've got large amounts of information that have to be disseminated to your employees, then you're probably going to be doing that more in a direct way. Because if you think about the communication process, it reminds me of the game telephone when you were a kid, if you ever played that, where one person picks up the phone and says, you know, so-and-so, you know, some juicy gossip about a person, and then the next person says it to the next person, and by the time you get back to the first person, it's not at all what it was originally in the first message. So that's kind of the thought here. Obviously, I boiled that way down to simplicity, but you know, how much of that information needs to be consistent when it's being disseminated to employees that are maybe middle management, and then even lower than that, rank and file employees. So all of those elements that you see on page 90 are important considerations in looking at personal discretion and coordinating mechanisms. Okay, so our next item is division of labor. And in division of labor, this is how should jobs be specialized. And the division of labor can be on the high axis on the left-hand side, then down the continuum to the low on the right-hand side. So think about the concept of an HR department. And as we continue to grow, you know, we talked about that ratio of 1 per 100 employees, 1 HR person per 100 employees. As we continue to grow, it becomes necessary to add FTE headcount into the HR department. And typically when we do that, we're not going to have 2 managers or 2 directors. We're going to add individuals that are going to specialize in particular functions. Let's say benefits, or maybe recruiting, or maybe an HR generalist or receptionist, you know, just depending on the size and structure of the company. And so when we make those decisions about specialization, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is the concept of highly specialized versus low or not as specialized. So another example that I like to give is people who, I always love saying widgets, my widget makers, that comes from my manufacturing days. And so if you ever think about an assembly line, you know, one person doing one part of that assembly versus the same person taking the item from raw material to produced product. And so that's another thought concept in division of labor and how specialized you want that labor to be. Is the person going to be doing the same thing over and over again to that one specialized part, like recruiting or like that stage of the production process? Or are they going to be following it all the way through, like you would have in a management position, an HR management position, where they're responsible for a little bit of everything, given, again, the size of the organization? So that's the next one. Then the next one on page 92 is span of control. I would say, if I had to guess or give an estimate from an exam perspective, the ones that I get the most feedback on from people who have come back and taken the exams are functional versus product, departmentalization, for sure, and then span of control, which is the one that, let me flip the slide, the one that we're talking about now, and then matrix structures, which we'll get to in just a moment. So on span of control, this is the number of individuals under one supervisor. So how many people can a supervisor supervise before that number gets too big for them to adequately be able to manage that crew? And so there's a number of items that have to be considered that you'll see down at the bottom of 92 and onto 93. So contact required. Another piece of it goes into contact required is considering the level of education and training that the subordinates have. So if you're in a situation, I'll bounce back to my widget maker, where their duties that they're doing probably don't require a tremendously high level of skill, but they also don't necessarily have the requisite education that you would need to be able to fully walk away. Like in a situation with an HR department or function, for the most part, once we know that there's a capable leader in that department and all of our employees are skilled, they're educated, they know what to do, obviously we're going to have meetings and we're going to provide guidance, but it's not the same as having somebody on an assembly line that may not know what to do in the event that there's a problem. Of course, over time, you can change and ebb and flow the amount of span of control based on as the particular group of individuals learns the skill, learns the job, then you may be able to expand and have many more people with reporting to fewer supervisors. So it really is just a difference between how much contact is needed, how much education and subordinate training has gone into place or did they have coming into the job. And then number 3 and 4 on page 93 is the ability to communicate and the nature of the task. So those are the primary things that we're looking at when it comes to span of control. All right, so I want to make sure everybody can hear me still. I got a message that there wasn't any sound. Can you guys still hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So if you ever have that happen, the best thing to do is to log out and log back in. So let me just send that message real quick so that everybody knows. If you're ever having sound issues or anything with Zoom, really, that's the best thing to do is to log out and log back in, and it will get captured on my records that happened. So no worries from that perspective. All right, now we move on to the next one, which is matrix structure. And matrix structures are fairly common in organizations that are a combination of product and functional specializations. And so one of the things that I mentioned, we talked about Pepsi as an example. And so within Pepsi, there are all these divisions, right? We have Tropicana, we have soda, we have Frito-Lay, and let's talk about Tropicana, just because it's the closest to me, and I am familiar with them because I've had people that I know work there over the years. So they are segregated by product, but they are essentially really truly considered a matrix structure, because within the plant there are all different kinds of juice products being made. So there's the traditional regular orange juice that's being made, then there's the grapefruit juice, and there's the tangerine line, and then they have some smoothie products that they make there. So all of those are all being managed and produced in one location, but they still have functional associations with them. So I have a friend that worked there in accounting, and her area that she was responsible for was like out of the, how many of her juices, I think she had 4 different juices and the smoothies, and that was her area. So it's functional from the perspective of we still have to get those tasks done that are related to whatever we're producing. And that's really what happens in a matrix structure. So there are a lot of good advantages and disadvantages of matrix structure. Probably the most significant advantage is the ability of the organization to be very nimble and agile. And so you've got products coming and going, you've got functions in and out. So that agility to be able to bounce from product to product if necessary is an important component of a matrix structure. The con, I would say, one of the significant cons, and I can say this from personal experience, is the stress and the uncertainty that comes with having too many bosses. So you've got a boss over, as we look at the slide, a boss over product A, a boss over product B, and over product C. So the best experience I can share with you about this was I worked for a dental company, and we were segregated by divisions related to specific kinds of dentistry. And so my division was orthodontics, and my location did a number of different manufacturing processes and distribution processes for orthodontics, including if you ever had braces or have kids that have braces, the little tiny rubber bands that you put on the brackets of your braces to control how you open and close your mouth, the retainer cases, you know, molding injection, all different kinds of things. And so in our structure of the subject of things related to orthodontics, there were multiple sites of different things being produced still related to orthodontics. And so I had a general manager at my location here near where I live that was really my direct report. However, then I had a functional HR manager, HR director, I guess was really her position, that she sat in New York. And then I had a corporate HR VP that sat in the corporate headquarters in Pennsylvania. And I had inundated projects and direction coming from all 3 of those individuals all the time, like relentlessly. And everybody wanted their thing done now, right? And so it creates a significant amount of stress because they don't always talk to each other. So I might be getting a project from my direct supervisor, who's the president of the division, but then there's something that corporate needs related to, let's say, a business or a benefits initiative, and then my HR leader has something going on that's an HR initiative for the whole division. And so it can get really, really, really difficult. And I'll be honest, I had a couple of situations where I don't necessarily think that my HR boss and my president boss, I don't know if they were really very fond of each other, honestly, but they would constantly put me in the middle. And it got so bad one time that my president boss directly asked me to keep something a secret because he wanted to tell his boss, who was the senior VP, in his own time about changes that he wanted to make at our local location. And so he basically said, you know, I want you to know what's going on because I need your help with this, but I don't want you to tell your HR boss because it will get back to the SVP and I'm not ready to have that discussion yet. And I was like, really reluctant. I was like, I don't want to be in the middle here. Anyway, I went ahead with it, and it was supposed to be a short-term thing. Well, it didn't work out that way, and probably about a week later, I got, and my HR boss was not a nice person, I would say that, and I got the most scathing phone call from her saying, oh my God, I can't trust you. I can't believe you would do this to me. Just on and on and on and on. And it was ugly. It was really ugly. And so I dealt with it for a short period of time. And then eventually I went back to my boss, my president boss, and said, I'm over this. Y'all are acting like high schoolers, like I'm stuck in the middle, and this is not okay. And it was probably another 2 to 3 weeks before things got okay. But I can tell you that things with my HR boss were never the same after that. Never the same. So there's definitely some challenges that go along with matrix organizations. So yeah, got some people making comments, been there, done that, work smarter, not harder. Yeah, for sure. They never talk to each other. Definitely can be very difficult. So I would be very comfortable with the pros and cons, understanding the structure, and then the pros and cons of the matrix structure. And then the last section in this, or last page in this section rather, is about a mechanistic versus organic structure. And this is on page 95. So when we deal with this structure, I want you to hopefully recognize that the mechanistic structure or mechanistic looks very similar to centralized decision making, where everything is happening at that corporate entity. All of the rules and all of the guidelines and processes are all originating from that central, typically bureaucratic location. Very specialized jobs. And then when we flip over to the organic side, you can see the difference, where much more flexible, much more agile, ability to adjust. You've got the core leaders at that regional level, for example, making the decisions. Change can happen very quickly. You don't have to go 7 steps up the ladder, if you will. Much easier to deal with uncertainty. So definitely an organic structure would be, in my opinion, a better structure to operate in. And we're gonna look more closely at the differences between these two structures when we get into our section on leadership theories in a couple of sessions. And it'll become, I think, even more clear the differences between these two. Let's see, a couple of questions here. Christy said, did you have any good experiences with Matrix? That is the primary experience that I had of working in a Matrix environment. The rest of my experiences were more regional based with decentralized processes and decentralized from the corporate office. And we really got to do what we needed to do, how we needed to do it, and it was beautiful. I mean, at that company, I worked there for 10 years, so there would be literally weeks and weeks and weeks that I didn't talk to my boss, who was located in Phoenix. She knew I was doing what I needed to be doing. I mean, we emailed back and forth and stuff, but it could be, 2 or 3 months before I talked to her on the phone. So there's definitely pros and cons to both sides. I think on the Matrix side, the biggest pro is the agility to be able to turn and adjust, where when you have just a functional structure by itself or a product structure by itself, you don't necessarily have the ability to do those things. Okay, and wrapping up this section is our knowledge check question, which says a bureaucracy that is characterized by homogeneous functional departmentalization, centralized decision-making, formal rules and control mechanisms, and highly specialized jobs is considered A, mechanistic structure, B, organic structure, C, matrix structure, or D, paradox structure? All right, and while you all are answering that, let's see, we've got some answers still flowing in. I want to address something. I got a private message about attendance and, you know, calling people's names. So I do that right at the top of the hour, and I do it before I go recording. So if you don't happen to be here at 0800, you're probably not going to hear your name called. That doesn't mean that the system isn't recognizing you. As long as you're logging in through Zoom, you should be fine. But I do encourage people to keep track of their own attendance, because I mean, we go by the honor system. So in the event that there's, you know, one date off where you have that you were here and for some reason the system didn't pick it up, then, you know, we're going to be okay with that. If it's, you know, half the class and you say you were and we don't see that you were, that obviously would be a different situation. When I mean half the class, I mean half of the number of classes. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, now that we do have, it looks like a full group, is anybody here from Helena's class? Anybody visiting us from the daytime class before we move on? All right, so I see that you've got your name set as KPHU. Is that actually your first name? And Megan, I did see your email. Thank you. So you just have to make sure that you have a name that's recognizable. And also, I post a lot of things differently than Helena does. So if you want to be on my distribution list, then if you send me an email to mbowen@hr.com, I'll be happy to put you on there and you know, keep you posted on what we're doing. So, all right, Kim, I got it. Okay, no problem. As long as I know what the name stands for. Okay, so our answer here, back to the board, is A, mechanistic structure. Very good. I think almost everybody got that correct. All right, so any questions on any of those before I move on to the next topic, which is culture? All right, we can talk about it at the end of class as well. All right, moving on to organizational culture. The objectives for this section are, number one, differentiate between culture and climate and identify the 4 levels of culture. Number 2, list and explain the contributing factors towards culture development. And number 3, describe and sequence the 4 building blocks of the creative process. So our first slide looks at the difference between climate and culture. So the climate is something that is temporary. And one of the best ways that I remember the difference between climate and culture, of course, again, this is a good example of your knowledge of language, but I think of climate as in where you live and the climate that you live in. So, for example, people that live in seasonal areas that have 4 seasons, the climate changes throughout those 4 seasons. You go from hot to fall being cooler to winter being freezing, you know, into flowers in the spring. Versus culture in an organization are things that are created that are lasting, that are enduring, and for the most part, very resistant and difficult to change. And so this is one of my favorite sections of all of our materials, because as we go through, I'm going to tell you a story about an experience that I had as it relates to organizational culture, and loop the different things in that we're talking about. So let me give you a little bit of the background. The same company that I was actually just talking about with the matrix structure is the one that I'm going to use for this example. So I joined this organization when they had, the parent company that I was working for had just acquired two different entities in the orthodontic space. One was a manufacturing facility, which is where my office was located, and then the other was a sales entity that was based in Louisiana. And so we had employees from that entity that were relocating to Florida. And then the manufacturing entity also had a location, an additional manufacturing location in a very small part of rural Georgia. And so I was coming in at a point where the papers had been signed for the acquisition, and basically now having the responsibility of bringing together the parent company that hired me, Dentsply, and then both of these other entities. So we were in a situation of having three extremely different cultures. Dentsply as an organization is relatively bureaucratic. It's a very old company. It's been around for over 100 years. In fact, they went through another acquisition a couple of years ago. But very structured, very formal, decentralized to an extent, but definitely had the big brother element of control. The manufacturing entity that we purchased was owned by a single individual from its inception. And he was a mean, nasty man. And I'll tell you more about him in a minute. The sales entity from Louisiana was a flashy, showy, very sales-oriented group of individuals. Sales and marketing were what they did. So, you know, you've got your flashiness, your marketing, your A-type personalities, and then you've got the manufacturing entity that was, at the point I joined the organization, which was literally 60 days after it went through, the acquisition went through, I mean. So I was coming into it when everything was completely fresh. Well, I laugh when I say this because one of the things that they didn't tell me during the interview process, there was a couple of things that jumped out to me as, you know how you put your hand on your head and you're like, things that make me go, And I just kind of filed it in my file box of a brain and, you know, reserved judgment until I got in there. But one of the first things that I noticed right away, and this goes into cultural artifacts. So our first item here in yellow. So cultural artifacts are tangible things that you can see and that you experience in the culture. So the environment, the landscape. And so when I walked into the company for my in-person interview, one of the first things I noticed was everything was very old. So really run down, needed to be painted. All of the furniture was like completely metal desks from like the 1970s. Like things were very old. And I am not a pretentious person by any means. So it wasn't that it necessarily bothered me or, you know, I stubbed my nose at it, but I just noticed that things were very old. So I would come to find out as I, you know, very quickly learned that it was all based on the owner. And so he was a very difficult man to work with and to work for. And so once I accepted the job, I was then told, I chuckle at myself because it brings back a lot of memories. I was then told that when they did the due diligence of the HR department, they didn't do certain things ahead of time like you should. And one of the things that they didn't do was check I-9 compliance. And come to find out that of all of the employees that were in the main Florida location, about 90% of them were illegal and were not authorized to work in the United States. And this is a manufacturing company. And so I walked into an environment where not only are we trying to figure out how to scramble for staffing, but we did go through, and this had started before, just about 2 weeks before I came in, we did go through, and the HR boss met with every single employee that appeared to be unauthorized, presented them with the opportunity to give us the right documentation and authorization. And so of those that were offered, and everybody was offered, but of those that were really truly legal was only about 20% of that 90%. And so we're in a situation now where we can't stop production, and basically that would be what I would continue to learn about the culture, which is things that have to do with cultural values and shared norms and shared assumptions. And so he deliberately, the owner, deliberately hired these individuals knowing they were undocumented so that he could do whatever he wanted with them. It was so sad. And so what I walked into was no consistency in anything. No consistency in pay, no consistency in how they were treated, no consistency, especially in gender. The ethics were really, really bad. And so the norms on the top of page 98 are things that you can determine that aren't spoken, but are inferred and observed by how people act. And when I tell you that people, the overwhelming culture was fear, because he would just walk up to somebody and say, "You're fired, get out of here." And he knew that they were illegal and that there was nothing that they could do about it. So if there was a sexual harassment complaint, he was like, "Yeah, so what?" I mean, it was awful. And so now here comes this multi-million-dollar global organization, Dentsply, with really deep pockets. And we got to figure out a way to fix this, because now that we have the employees that are remaining that are legal, and we, squared up that whole process, now we've got to figure out how we're going to get employees and how we're going to unprogram culturally the ones that we still have. There was nepotism there. Oh my gosh, it was just insane. You would look at a compensation report and you would have 10 employees that had all been there, let's say 5-ish years. Comp was all over the place. There could be a $5 variance between 2 different people. I mean, it was crazy. Let's see, how long did I stay there for? Actually, I would have stayed there a lot longer, but that's when my daughter got sick. And so I left, I had to leave on FMLA, and then I couldn't come back because she just didn't get better. So I was there about 3 years, I guess, totally. But when I sat down with the managers and I talked about the values, the cultural values that were there, I mean, the managers were so scared. I mean, we're talking grown men here and women who literally would be like, "We have no power, we have no authority, we can't do anything, we get screamed at," just ugly, 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 ugly. And so shared assumptions is really the piece about the fear, where there was this underlying tone. I mean, you could walk through the building and you could just feel it in the energy. Nobody wanted to talk to me at first. And fortunately, I think because I'm outgoing and, you know, gregarious, if you will, I spent so much time on the floor, on the production lines. And that was another thing that really struck me as odd when I interviewed. They wouldn't let me go on the production lines, especially my HR boss. And she said it was because I didn't have the correct shoes on. You just can't wear heels in that environment. So possibly okay. But basically, I think it was more because she didn't want me to see truly what was going on. And so as I continued to work through that, you know, there was just so many projects and so many things that had to be done. And so as we continue to look at culture, I'm going to stay with the same kind of the situation I'm describing and talk about the development of culture. So expectations of founders and leaders, right? So the managers that were working for this gentleman, like I said, they were scared. They didn't know what to do. They literally, I spent a lot of time with about 5 different individuals for the first 6 months, just unprogramming them and then trying to reprogram them to the culture and the values of Dentsply, which was amazing. I mean, they really had a, you know, key components of their values that were really aligned with my beliefs. So from that perspective, I really enjoyed, you know, working there. And then, you know, member contributions is the next one. And almost all of the employees there were Hispanic. And I would say of the ones that left that were, or the ones that remained rather, that were actually legitimately able to work, there was a tremendous amount of nepotism because he hired family and cousins and sisters and brothers. But even after all these people left, and that was so sad to have to watch people that had worked together for 10 and 15 years have to leave because he, you know, did what he did. But one of the things that always warmed my heart so much was that every Friday, regardless of what was going on the outside with this really awful man, that they would all bond together and everyone would bring a dish in for lunch. And so, you know, the majority of the employees were Hispanic. So you'd have all kinds of things, you know, from all of the different countries, and they would sit and they would laugh and they would, you know, just have a wonderful time in the company given the situation that they were in. And so eventually, you know, I got invited. I felt like I had really hit a milestone when, you know, one of the employees came in and said, "You want to have lunch today?" And he was really nice. So, Brooke, did this guy get fired? So he actually came into the beginning of the acquisition as a quote unquote consultant, but he clearly skated out because he could see that we weren't going to play in the same sandbox that he had played in. But the biggest challenge was his son was the sales director. So it was really trepidatious for a while because this, you know, he was like a direct line back to dad about all the things that were going on. And he eventually, he lasted a lot longer. I shouldn't chuckle about that, but he lasted a lot longer than I expected him to, the son. And then he left shortly after I had to leave. But so member contributions, historical accommodations, and that's related to external and internal adaptation and integration, where we're coming together to connect pieces of the culture internally and based on, of course, what's happening externally in the environment. And, you know, I remember my boss, my president boss being like, you know, when do you think this is going to get better? And it doesn't seem like it's getting better. And I was like, you have to remember that we're trying to unwind 30 years of engraved behaviors in these employees, minions, exactly. And so, oh yeah, the family members, let me tell you, they were everywhere. I just, the ones that lasted and the ones that stayed, you know, some of them made it, some of them didn't, but it was really, yeah, a lot. And then when we move into maintaining organizational culture, so certainly employee selection and discipline all over the place. You know, he knew that he could hire whoever he wanted and treat them however he wanted because they had no rights to go to the EEOC to make a claim of discrimination or harassment. In fact, the first year that I started, I ended up investigating and subsequently firing 2 of the team leaders that were males. There was no women. There was only 1 woman in a leadership position, a departmental manager. All the rest of them were males, and then all of the employees predominantly were female. And so there was very much that kind of machismo culture going on with the supervisors. And so they ended up, 2 of them ended up getting fired. I mean, there was all kinds of craziness going on. Rewards and status allocation. One of the major things that I think I told my boss was a huge priority, not only because we now owned the business and the liabilities that came along with it, but just out of fairness, was that I did a whole complete compensation evaluation and analysis by department to figure out where our issues were. And then I made some pretty significant adjustments about a year and a half in. We couldn't do everything we wanted to do because it would have tipped us the wrong way in expenses versus income. But then, you know, I sat down with each employee individually and said, this is not what we are about. We're going to fix this. Here's what we're doing so far. In some cases, it was, you know, a couple of dollars an hour that they were just so off. And of course, the, you know, performance reviews were non-existent, and discipline was, you know, so varied. It was just crazy. Leader reactions is another thing about, you know, developing a culture. And we'll talk about this more in leadership theories, but I'm sure you all can appreciate the fact that, you know, leaders have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And so if you have somebody up on a pedestal telling you one thing and how to operate, but doing another, you're going to create issues with trust, and you're not going to trust the individual, whether that's your direct boss or that's the executive level managers of the company. So those leader reactions can be really, really important as it relates to what is the message that we want our employees to experience. Rites and ceremonies, talked a little bit about the Friday lunches. The first year that we did an actual holiday party, oh, they were so just, I was grinning from ear to ear. They were so overwhelmed. I mean, we did, not only did we cater a meal, but we did raffles and gave away TVs and, I mean, just all kinds of different things. And they were just shocked. And we didn't do that because we were making it special. We did that because that's what the company did at all locations. It wasn't something unique to just our experience with this location. It was just the culture of the organization. And then I think stories and symbols is something that is really important as you're developing a culture. And culture is going to evolve over time. Culture is going to change when you have leadership changes. So I'm sure some of you might have experienced going through the process of an acquisition, and maybe on both sides or one side or the other, being acquired or, you know, being the ones to acquire, and the things that you have to deal with related to those changes, related to the culture. How are those going to be different? And how, the last one, reactions to problems. You know, how does the leadership team react? How does the employees view that reaction? And so all of those pieces are fundamental parts of the culture. Let's see, Brooke mentioned, I'm surprised when they acquired this company that more red flags didn't show up and prevent them from stepping in the hornet's nest. I think, honestly, it was from the business side that this was the entity that we really needed to push the company in the direction that it was going in the orthodontics market. And so it really rounded out the the sales items that we needed to have, and it was injection molding. And then eventually, about a year after I left, they shut the Georgia facility down, and some of those employees relocated to Florida. But it was so interesting in the Georgia facility because there, almost all the employees were Caucasian. There was a good mix of genders. 99%, I think we had one employee who wasn't legal, and she was Hispanic, but there just wasn't, that wasn't the dynamic of the employment market. So everything in that area were not Hispanic undocumented employees that he could find and hire. They were all, it was kind of a rural area of Georgia, kind of country, if you will. And so that was the majority of the demographic. And so you didn't have, you still had the problem of him being a jerk and how he did things, but you didn't have the issue with the undocumented employees because of the available employment market. Christy mentioned, I have a good symbol story. The hospital I work for is a religious system and just went through a rebranding. As part of the rebranding, they worked the cross into one of their marketing symbols, religious, or I think you meant not. It's kind of cool. So that is neat that, you know, they still were looking at keeping those traditions. We have a health system in Tampa that is, I think underlying is Baptist. And so they, you know, employees, they deal with that same kind of issue. All right, so let's move on to the next part, which is changing the culture. And how do you change the culture? And so the first thing, and I want you to notice a very likely pattern here, is conducting an audit. So when you're conducting an audit, you're analyzing and you're assessing what potentially needs to change. And so when we go to the next level, which is unfreezing the culture, unfreezing is the change effort that you're going through in order to put forth what aspects of your change plan you're doing to alter the culture. The next step of eliciting support from the cultural elite, this is a key piece. Whenever you're doing organizational development interventions, when you're doing any change that has to deal with culture, I can tell you how important this step was, that I quickly learned who was the cultural elite in the organization, who were the influencers, that I knew that if I could help them understand, there's about 5 people, a mix of people, that I could help them understand that they were gone of the bad guy, that we truly were different, that we meant what we said, that we were committed to making things better. And once I got the buy-in from those individuals, things became much easier because I, talked with them and helped them understand, hey, these are the things that we're doing. One of the other things that was totally crazy was there were 4 different benefit plans. So the hourly employees had one plan, the salaried employees had another, the Georgia employees had a third. I guess technically there was 5 plans because the Louisiana employees had their own, and then we had corporate that I was a part of. And so imagine trying to simultaneously manage 5 different health plans and going through and and we didn't have the money to align everything at one time. So we did baby steps. The first year we added on life insurance and disability. The following year we changed the 401k plan. The year after that we were adding dental. And then finally, in the final year of the plan, we were, adding healthcare, and obviously healthcare being the most expensive of all of them. So yeah, it was pretty crazy. And then of course the last 2 steps: implement and then monitor and evaluate. Then we look at creativity and innovation. So as things change in the environment, even when you get the organization to the place where you want the culture to be and you're fairly satisfied with evaluating culture, where things are at, you're going to have to continue to adapt. So a good example of this would be if you have senior leadership change. So if you have changes at your executive level related to leadership, you're going to be in a situation where the culture potentially could change. And when you see questions on the exam about culture, one of the things that I definitely want you to pay attention to is the fact that culture is not something that you can change overnight, and that you have to have the basically support of leadership in order to make those changes. Because you can recommend, but if the leadership doesn't see those changes as valuable, it's not going to go anywhere. So that's a really important component, is making sure that you have leadership support. So the creative process here, it's similar from the perspective of what we just talked about. And in the last slide, we're just kind of substituting different words. So preparation would obviously be the analysis, looking at the audit, looking at what's needed, coming up with the plan. Incubation would be the plan. What are you going to implement? Insight would be evaluation. Is it going the way you planned it to go? What needs to be changed? What needs to be altered? What's good to go and okay? And then verification, again, is that evaluation piece, and then potentially making the changes that you might need to make. The next slide just talks about developing a culture of inclusion. And we're actually going to go through a section in Unit 5 about diversity. But aside from that direct topic of diversity, having a culture of inclusion means that everybody is confident and feels comfortable that they are welcome, that they are wanted and desired in the organization, that everybody's on the same page regarding ethics and integrity and values, and that there is, hopefully the elimination of segregation. And then, of course, as I mentioned already, senior support is extremely important. Okay, our last slide of this section is about changing an organizational culture. And our choices are: A, dangerous to the stability of the organization's members and should not be attempted. B, impossible because an organization's culture is frozen. C, difficult because it would require an alteration of the basic assumptions of the organization. Or D, as simple as acquiring new artifacts and symbols to represent the desired changes. All right, how are we doing? Another point I want to add related to the exam, and this is probably more for senior level test takers, but it's about mergers and acquisitions because there's a section in the book in Unit 1 that will talk about that. And culture and the misalignment of culture in mergers and acquisitions is one of the biggest misses that can literally make an acquisition fail. If there is not an awareness between what was and what is now going to be and a plan in place about that, then you can have a significant amount of problems for sure. I can't imagine, going from what Dentsply was and what they valued the other way into, our employees, then into the environment where the owner was going to stay. Oh my gosh, it would have been horrible. Let's see. So I want to mention this, and it was a private message that says, interestingly, a question on the practice test was about how just a few people can change culture. So it is confusing that so much focus is on how culture is hard to change, and the test answer was how it could easily change. Well, without seeing the specifics of the question, I might offer that it could have been about the cultural elite that I talked about, because once you have the influencers signed on to the change, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about culture, it could be about a business change, it could be about a schedule change, and you all probably know in your organizations, if you have contact with the employees, some of you may not if you're in a corporate office and you don't see those folks, but knowing who those people are and connecting with them is super important to be able to get anything done really as it relates to employees being on board with something. All right, so the majority of you for this question selected C, which is correct. It is difficult but not impossible. All right, so anybody have any questions on any of that? We are consistently seeing questions about culture on the SHRM exams for whatever reason. So if you're a SHRM taker, just keep that in mind, about feeling comfortable about the topic of organizational culture. Okay, well, let's move on. We have some additional time to move into global HR management and take a look at our objectives. Number 1, identify the key components driving business globalization and the role of HR. Number 2, describe the 4 approaches to HR. And finally, number 3, discuss international cultural differences and challenges that expatriates may face. All right, so do we have any global people in our group? Anybody work for a global company or have global responsibilities? Anybody out there? Oh, Christy, Disney, yay. Definitely global. Oh, Christina works for a corporate offices, is in Norway. Sam has a small team in the UK. Company based in Taiwan, Emily said. Oh, oil and gas, of course, for sure. And then Megan in Canada. All right, so I think the first takeaway that you need to make the comparison with is going back to when we first talked about strategy. And we talked about strategy formulation, and it's no different at a global level. So we're still going to go through the process of the SWOT analysis. We're still going to go through the pest or the pestle analysis. We're still going to be looking at how does the strategic plan of the organization, how are we going to, as HR, supplying human capital, not only people, but programs, compensation, benefits, employment practices, how are we going to support the organization? And so the process of looking at those areas of SWOT and PEST are going to be just as important on a domestic basis as they are a global basis. And when we move into the stages of global HR management, then this becomes important as it relates to how involved HR is going to be. So the first level of global entities is import-export firms. So these are companies that either import goods into the U.S. or export goods out of the U.S. At that level, there typically is not HR involvement because they're not employees working in other parts of the world. It's simply something that's happening at the either manufacturing and distribution level going out, or at the intake and processing level coming in to the U.S. Of course, you're going to have customs issues that you'll have to deal with, but for the most part, all of your employees are going to be U.S.-based employees at that first tier. The next tier is the MNE, multinational enterprise. I also want you to jot down the abbreviation MNC, which is multinational corporation. Those two terms are synonymous. So enterprise or corporation, you could possibly see it both ways. I think you'll see it consistently on one vendor or the other, but you could see it as an enterprise or see it as a company or corporation, and just know that it's reflecting the same thing. So MNEs usually start out with expatriates. So expatriates are US-based employees that go out into designated areas of the world for expansion of the business. They're typically one of the first ones on the ground as the business is expanding, because they're bringing that US business into that geographic entity. And so they're the leader, if you will, for the most part. They may be a project manager that gets things off the ground and then either comes back to the US or goes to another location. And we'll talk more about expatriates a little later in this section. But referring, having expatriates out in those geographic areas then does start to involve human resources. And so then the decision has to be made, are we going to manage the MNE HR functions from our US entity, or are we going to expand HR into those geographic areas? You might have one person on the ground and then, they're just your point person. That person might be what we call a local national, which is someone who is from the area that you are moving into. And then you have to decide how to deal with all of the issues as it relates to the business functioning from an HR perspective. So payroll, taxes, benefits, employment, hiring, all of those processes that we deal with on a regular basis are going to obviously have to be duplicated as that expansion happens. And then number 3 is global firms. And global firms are designed to be entities that are existing all over the world. So MNEs typically are going to start out with the US and maybe one other country. And then it could expand into other countries after that. But ultimately, a global enterprise is going to be a US-based headquarters with multiple locations throughout the world. They could be regionally centered, like let's say in Asia, as an example, or they could be, you know, one in Asia, one in Africa, one in Europe, you know, whatever the segments are based on the business and what the business is doing, essentially. Oh, let's see. Brooke said, my dad was an expat and we relocated to Singapore by his company. I bet that was pretty exciting. I mean, I've always thought about, you know, what would that be like? I don't know, does anybody, I usually bring this up later, but it just popped into my head. Does anybody watch House Hunters on Home and Garden, HGTV? So House Hunters is a great show. If you've never watched it, there's a domestic show and then there's House Hunters International. And I love it because it really shows you, and this will come up later in this section, but in the US, bigger is better. We are obsessed with the big, the most, the lot, you know, big houses, big bathrooms. And you watch House Hunters International and they're trying to find homes, you know, and they could be over there for many different reasons. It could be for school, it could be for employment, it could be that they just decided to move. And you get these people that are looking for these, you know, 2,000 square foot apartments or houses that have these, you know, huge bathrooms like we love. And the bathroom is like a broom closet. And so really just fascinating looking at the cultures that they walk into and sometimes the crazy amounts of money. I think I watched one the other day. It was in, oh, where was it? Was it Norway? I'm not sure where it was, but the rent, the US dollars rent that their budget was $5,000 a month. I was like, whoa. And even for $5,000 a month, they were getting like an 850 square foot apartment. So just amazing how the differences are. Let's see, living in the Midwest countryside, was relocated. Oh, I lost the comment. Brooke mentioned city, state, very populated. Whenever I've seen anything about Singapore, I've seen the same thing. Like there are people everywhere. Andrea, you're supposed to get more square footage if you live further away from city center. Yeah, and they show that, you know, on the show when they show the little map and they show house A, house B, house C. It's definitely a fun show to watch. Oh, Kim, I bet. California, for sure. That's why I got an opportunity to move to California when I was with the company I was with for 10 years, Drive Time. About 6 months after I started with the company, my boss called me and asked me if I wanted to go to California, and I said, no. My only pause was Northern California because I loved San Francisco and Sacramento, but yeah, I'm not going to move there. I feel very bad for those of you who do work in California. All right, so let's see. Let me just do maybe a couple of more pages and then we'll be at a good stopping point. So on the HR structures side, there's a couple of other structures that we want to make sure that you're aware of. So the first one is Born Global, which essentially means from the inception of the organization, the company is global right away. So they have a US base, but they also start out with a company that has entities in other parts of the world. Offshoring and outsourcing are probably things that you are familiar with. So offshoring is when processes are relocated, usually to save on cost. So one of the best descriptions I can, that I can give is for Walmart, when they offshore all of their clothing production. Like none of the clothing in Walmart, that's Walmart clothes, I don't mean like Fruit of the Loom that might be made in the US or whatever, is made in the US. It's all made in other countries because, of course, they can get labor for cheaper. Same thing with companies that outsource to get an issue with getting more essentially for their money and moving those processes, contracting with a foreign company to have like call centers. So if you ever call maybe your credit card in the middle of the night, it goes to someone who you can tell probably may not be from the US. And I think the most frustrating thing about those situations is that they are reading off of a script. Like, I don't care, as long as I can understand you and we can have a conversation, it's fine, but there's like no deviation from the script. So if you start asking specific questions, like I have Xfinity for cable, and they do that. If you call it night for tech support, it goes somewhere overseas. So it can be super, super frustrating. And then the last item that we'll talk about tonight is approaches to global HR. And so multinational enterprises have to decide how they want their organizations to be structured based on different types of approaches. So the first approach is ethnocentric. Ethno defines as one. And so an ethnocentric organization is one that still remains centralized with that US-based office. So everything is flowing out of the US into those multinational enterprises or multinational locations. And so there's not a lot of deviance that you would see from a local entity of wherever the company is physically located. So the next one is poly. Poly means more than one, and polycentric organizations, M&Es, are structured based on the physical location that they have expanded to. So using Singapore as an example. So what happens in the Singapore community, how businesses are run, how HR processes happen, how operational processes happen, are all going to be based on that location geographically. And of course, they're still going to have, connection to the corporate entity domestically, but they're really going to be run by local people, usually still with an expat to get things started. And then regiocentric is where you're creating regional based hubs. So like Asia, like I mentioned. So the business might expand to multiple locations in a particular region because those businesses run similarly, and then they're treated like polycentric from the perspective of operations. So still having that connection to the US, but decentralized for the most part. And then the last one is geocentric, which basically means whole or central or center. And geocentric entities essentially are going to autonomously go in search of best practices. So it may be a combination of things from the local environment as well as the corporate environment but they're going to adapt to what's going on in their surroundings, essentially. So those are the 4 primary areas. And we're going to take a pause now. So when we reconnect on Thursday, we're going to start with page 114 on international cultural differences. And then we'll finish this section. So that's page 114 through the end of the section, which is 123. And then our next area is leadership and management theories. And then we also should probably get into decision making. So I'm going to say from 114, I think is what I just said. I'll put it in the hive. 114 through 140. And I'm going to plan on working a little over on Thursday. I don't want us to get too far behind. I don't get crazy concerned about it, but just to try to align as much as possible with the daytime class. And then we will work on that. And then just be aware that whenever we do stay over, you're only committed for the money back guarantee for the 75 minutes. So don't ever feel like if you need to leave, you can leave. My only thing is to make sure that you're catching up with the video of picking up where you left off, especially if it's an area of content you're not familiar with. I mean, if you're a recruiter and it's in selection, which is in unit 2, yeah, you may not have to worry about it. You could read the material and probably be fine. But if it's an area that you've had no exposure to, then you definitely, if you're not able to stay, want to make sure that you catch up. Let's see here. Oh, Brooke mentioning about, yeah, IT in India. And then Hannah mentioning, should we still be planning to take our Unit 1 test by this weekend? I would say no. I mean, you can definitely take it anytime you want, so I don't want to discourage you, but from the context of being finished with the unit, then no, we won't be finished with the unit. We'll be finished with it at I think probably the beginning of next week. And then, you know, moving on to Unit 2. One of the things that we will also be looking at is flashcard reviews. So that will be coming up at the end of the unit. I usually, it's either before class or after class, we'll do a flashcard review. It's voluntary, it's just additional, a resource. So there are people out there who are kinesthetic and who really like to deal with flashcards and making their own cards, and that's a really great way to study and learn. It's not everybody's cup of tea, if you will, but it can be really helpful. So we do some flashcard review, and when we get closer, we'll look at what date and what time. I'll have you vote on that through a poll of what makes sense to have that, and it is recorded. So if you're not able to participate because of other commitments, then that's fine. Let's see. Yeah, thank you, Lori. 114 through, did I say 150? Probably. That sounds about right. Nope, not 140. Now I got to go back and look at it. Yeah, 140, I think is probably what we'll get to. And I'll take a closer look at that and update it. And then let's see, there was another question I saw, Christina, is the Coach's Corner review session scheduled for each week this month? So Coach's Corner is something that happens on Tuesday evenings at 8 o'clock Eastern time. They're generally 30 minutes to an hour, and the content varies. Jen typically doesn't invite groups to Coach's Corner until about a month into the sessions. Usually by the time we finish Unit 1, she's inviting. So are you seeing those on the Hive with the dates? Is that how you know about them? Or did she talk? She might have talked about them in orientation as well. Oh, okay. Okay, on the syllabus. Yeah, so she'll send an email out to everybody that will say, hey, you're invited to Coach's Corner. And it's just, it's driven by topics that we know are either hard or on the exam that we get reports back that, you know, cause a lot of fright. It's not the best word, but areas that we know that we need to spend more time on, I guess is the thing. And it's driven by student request. And then as instructors, we all get together and, you know, fill out a list of things that we want to cover. And so, yeah, they're 30 to 60 minutes, and they're recorded as well. So eventually there's a Coach's Corner tab on the Buzz that Jen will upload those to. All right, great questions. Anything else you all can think of tonight before we head out? All right, guys. Well, I will hang out for a few more minutes to see if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on Thursday. Take care, everybody. Good night. All right, looks like we are dwindling down, so I'm going to sign off as well. Have a great week, and we'll see you Thursday. Thanks, everybody.